Hey everyone, Raptor Chatter here, and we're going to be looking at some of the biggest papers to come out for paleontology in the month of February 2024. Let's get started. Starting with a paper that was actually a talk that I saw at the Society of Paleontology meeting in October. It's talking about how exceptional fossil preservation can actually cause a bias in our understanding of evolutionary history. And it did this through a number of different means, mainly in Asia, looking at the entire record of 3 separate groups, which are the non-bird dinosaurs, things that are very closely related to birds and birds, as well as squamates, or lizards. The reason Asia was picked for this study is because you have 2 different environments that are both really good at preserving different animals. First, you have the Gobi Desert, which has tons of lizard fossils, but then you also have the J-hole biota, which has tons of early bird fossils. So it's really good to see how those 2 specific locations actually influence our understanding of the evolution of these different groups. You can see this trend in some of these graphs. For example, you can look at birds and look at the J-hole versus the Gobi Desert. And in the Gobi Desert, there's 4 fossils of them. Meanwhile, there are multiple species coming from the J-hole biota. So it's really interesting for trying to understand how these different preservational biases actually occur and how we can understand them better. One of the main things they looked at in this paper, though, was how complete the organisms are. And you can see that squamates, lizards, really aren't that complete. Birds have a slight increase, and then the non-bird theropods have a massive increase. And that's likely because they were larger, so a little more resistant to the different forces in the environment and the geologic forces that would have fossilized them. They wouldn't necessarily just be obliterated into dust the way smaller animals might have been. As for the further results on the biases, I really think the birds are super useful here because you can look at all of Asia, which seemingly has pretty good completeness records for birds. But then you remove the J-hole biota and it dips massively as far as how complete these organisms were. Additionally, then you can have the Gobi Desert and it doesn't really change that much for the birds. This is also really important because you can kind of see the opposite thing happening with the lizards, where if you have the Gobi Desert in there, it shows them as being really complete, but if you don't, they decrease in their amount of completeness. These kinds of biases were then applied to broader environments across the entire planet, using databases that have good records on many different fossils. And what they found is, for example, with lizards, it's great. We have a ton of good lizard fossils coming from all of the continents combined. However, there's a massive bias towards them being in Aeolian dune type environments, i.e. the Gobi Desert, which is really hinting at the fact that we really know about lizard evolution simply because the Gobi Desert exists and we can find lizard fossils there. Without that, we'd have almost nothing. And that's really shown in these phylogenies, where you can see the phylogeny that we have made up, but then after a little while you can take out some of these different environments, and you can see how it doesn't show the full picture of these animals' evolution, which is really important to understand. We don't necessarily get the full picture unless we have these really great preservational environments. However, at the same time, because we have those great preservational environments, it means we're also missing some of those differences that are occurring in evolution. For example, very few geckos live in deserts. Some do, admittedly, even some near me, like the western banded gecko. But that's one species, as opposed to the many more that can live in marine forests. So it's really an intense bias of how we understand the fossil record. Now, paleontologists have always known that there is a bias in the fossil record, but this quantifying it, not necessarily in the many things don't get preserved, but where they're getting preserved is very important. Because that way you can say the birds that we're finding to understand their evolution were living around alpine lakes in the J-hole biota. And the lizards we're finding to understand their evolution were mostly living in the deserts of Central Asia. It's entirely different environments, but they still let us understand at least something about their evolution. Just not as much as we would have ideally. But there's also a paper looking at mammal diversity, and specifically the decline of some of their early diversity with how different groups died out. They did this with a similar database looking at many different continents, and what they found is that there were certain groups that essentially just died out earlier on. This figure really shows that, where you can see early mammal groups and where they occurred at different times during the Mesozoic, from the late Triassic through the early Jurassic to the late Jurassic and through to the end Cretaceous. This is really interesting, though, that so many of these groups are essentially dying off so early, because when you're looking at birds, we don't have that happening. The birds stayed diverse all the way up until the KPG extinction. So it's really just a strange question of why suddenly do the mammals all just start dying out early, and then just the few groups that did survive that KPG impact suddenly flourish. because it doesn't seem like that was the trend. Instead, it seemed like the trend was mammal groups dying out, and that's not what happened after that impact, but only up until that impact. On the subject of some of those early mammals, Tikitherium was one of them, and I say was in a very specific context here, because that fossil was actually reworked. Reworking is what happens when fossils erode out of another sediment and are deposited in a new one. And the thing is, all of this sediment ran off of what was mostly Triassic rocks, and so it was thought that this small jaw fragment that included a tooth was a very early mammal relative. This paper, though, looked at it in better detail and went, yeah, this isn't actually from the Triassic. It had gotten washed out of other sediments and deposited with a lot of Triassic rock sediments that had also eroded, but it's actually a fairly recent shrew. So unfortunately, Tikitherium isn't this massive, wonderful organism that shows us, hey, look, this is the earliest mammal. Instead, it's showing us that there's shrews just a few thousand to maybe a few million years ago, which we kind of already knew. Before the Triassic, though, there were other mammal relatives, some of them being very predatory, like the gorgonopsids. However, there's a lot of variation in this, and this paper essentially went, okay, well, what were these things eating, and how would they have hunted differently? What they were able to do is show a number of different trends from being more raptorial specialists, which is they are moving fast and catching small prey, versus just eating mega herbivores, so hunting things like the large parasaurs, which would have been around in Pangaea during the latest part of the Permian. Importantly, though, they also show a shift from the early to the late Permian, with fewer of these synapsids being raptorial predators, which once the Permian-Triassic mass extinction hits that kills off 75% of life on land, there's mostly going to be small things. This means that the reptiles that had probably mostly filled those kind of more raptorial predation roles were more suited to be able to succeed through that extinction, and that potentially could have led to the giant burst in diversity that we do see in the archosaurs during the Triassic, which I will also talk about later. Before that, though, we have news on another gorgonopsid, Inostrancevia, which the first fossil of it from the southern hemisphere was described just a little while ago coming from South Africa. And the one from South Africa comes from a time period where the other large gorgonopsids would have died out. This is really interesting because Inostrancevia is mostly known from Russia, which suggests that there was some kind of differences in the environments where Inostrancevia was able to do well in the north, and then only once those other animals died out in the south, it was able to migrate to the southern continents. There's a new fossil of one, though, coming from Tanzania, and it probably would have lived alongside some of those other gorgonopsids. So it's not necessarily the straight top predator replaces extinct top predator kind of idea that seemed to be hinted at. So it seems like there was a lot more variation in what was happening with these animals. Staying in the Permian, Bromerpeton subcolossus is a new species of microsaur coming from the Permian of Germany. The microsaurs were a group of very early amphibians, and they may actually potentially be related to modern amphibians. Modern amphibian evolution is kind of all up in the air because we just don't have good fossils of early ones, at least in most cases, so it's hard to say anything really distinctive. But seemingly this could be a really good fossil for helping us understand how certain groups of amphibians were able to diverge in the Permian and then really become what we know them as in the Triassic. And I say this because it seems like genetically they split off very early, at least modern amphibian groups, but they don't really become the things we know them as, frogs, salamanders, and even caecilians, until the Triassic. So it seems like they were pretty consistent throughout most of their history, at least early history, and then suddenly the Permian-Triassic extinction happened and they just changed into what we know today. But of course, we couldn't have those tetrapods like amphibians if there wasn't already life on land, including forests. And a look at some of the rocks near Devon in the UK actually shows the earliest forest during the Devonian, which, yes, the rocks are literally named for the town. It makes a lot of sense when you're trying to name rocks way back in the day. That said, it's still really interesting to see that this is evidence of the earliest forests, and they didn't seem to be particularly large. In fact, most of the areas that these rocks that contain these fossils were found in don't really have a ton of fossils, so it's generally considered not to have them. However, now there's growing evidence that at least there were parts in a kind of patchy forest throughout this environment. And they go through a lot of detail on how different parts of this forest could have formed, with some of it forming along riverbanks, and then different riverbanks collapsing, moving some of these trees out towards the sea where they could become fossilized, and a number of other traits. However, it's still really cool to see that this is the earliest evidence we have of complex forests in the world. And with those trees came insects, specifically beetles, which we do have somewhat of a record from the Paleozoic before the Permian-Triassic extinction. And it seems like many of those groups of beetles that were early were very attached to the gymnosperm trees that were around. And so because of that, they did suffer during the end Permian Triassic extinction when a lot of plants died. However, importantly, they did make it through, and they were able to stay moderately diverse up until the point when angiosperms showed up. These are fruiting trees, trees with flowers. This is really important because suddenly after that point, beetles exploded in diversity, and they were able to, with that tight attachment to other types of trees, essentially co-opt a new niche in these angiosperm trees and become much more successful. Still back in the Permian though, we're looking at one of the oldest fossils coming from the Alps that was purported to show fossilized skin. Tridentinosaurus was the specimen. And I say was not because it doesn't exist anymore, but because this paper used a ton of different analytical techniques to look at this purported skin and basically go, hey, this is just paint. It was also found a long time ago, so potentially they were just trying to help highlight where the fossil was. But also potentially they were just trying to improve its importance because they thought, no one's going to know this is paint. It's one of the issues that paleontology does have with people essentially trying to make up extra data to seem more important. Unfortunately, with this analysis, they were also able to look at the bones and go, hey, these bones are really, really eroded. So Tridentinosaurus probably isn't even valid. It doesn't really have any characters that are diagnostic to only it. Instead, it's just a interesting fossil still. There's good bones there, but we just don't actually have them prepped out very well. So maybe that'll be the next step, is pulling the bones out of the rock and seeing if there's anything else hidden in the rock. But for the parts that are at the surface, it doesn't seem that important. Staying in reptiles, but jumping to snakes, there's a paper on the macroevolutionary singularity that is snakes, which essentially means snakes did a lot of things to simplify their body, but they are still very, very diverse. This is really well shown by this graph where you have the lizards over here, which they all have limbs and skulls that aren't totally destroyed so that they can swallow things whole. So you would expect them to have a lot more diversity, but they're all in this little tiny area of this graph. Meanwhile, then you can look at snakes, where there's a much broader area of different niches they fill. They do a lot despite not having a lot of body to evolve and change, which helps to show that potentially there's a lot of flexibility in what they can do. The thing is, you would expect some lizards, especially since the snakes evolved directly out of the lizards, to have something similar, especially legless lizards. In fact, some, like legless geckos, even have similar extreme skull morphology where they can swallow large prey. The biggest issue with that, though, is there are only 50 species of those legless geckos, as opposed to 3,100 species of just colubrid snakes, not including many of the venomous ones, that are around in the world. So the snakes are massively, massively diverse, and it's not exactly understood why, but seemingly developing all of their extreme adaptations, losing limbs, their skull morphology, all at once helped them to become very, very successful. The Alcaid-Medellin sandstone formation of Morocco has been suggested to be from the Middle to Late Triassic in age. And this is interesting because there's actually footprints in there, and the footprints help to support this but are also really unique. That's because there's many different taxa which actually don't normally coincide with one another. This includes things that are more commonly found in the Middle Triassic, such as Tikitherium and Apatopus from the Late Triassic. But here they coincide, which does again suggest a Middle to Late Triassic age, but it's really interesting seeing some of these changes that would have occurred. The Middle to Late Triassic is punctuated by the Carnian pluvial episode, where there would have been massive amounts of rain throughout most of the world. And that changed a lot of ecosystem dynamics where certain organisms started to take over environments. This includes some minor changes like the loss of the rhynchosaurs, but also things like the rise of the dinosaurs during the later Triassic. What this all means is potentially here in Morocco, we have a snapshot of how that change might have occurred. There are also footprints studied coming from Australia, and they came from the very early part of the Jurassic. This is actually really interesting because this is when dinosaurs were really starting to spread around the world, and based on the fossils, they would have been made by a mid-sized or even small ornithopod dinosaur, which would go on to evolve into things like the massive hadrosaurs of later. These tracks were actually first described in 1954, but believe it or not, science has advanced quite a bit in the last 70 years. And so what's actually happening is they were able to look at them and go, hey, it was walking fairly slowly, and then sped up to about 3.8 kilometers per hour. From 1.8 kilometers per hour. So it wasn't necessarily walking or speeding up quickly, but it at least shows some change in the behavior of its gait. That said, the main thing here is that this still would have been mostly Pangea, and it's showing that these dinosaurs, including ornithopods, were spreading around the different continents pretty well. And still in the Jurassic, but this time the later Jurassic, Jingia dongxingensis is a new mamenchisaurid sauropod coming from the late Jurassic of southern China. It's actually the first known mamenchisaur coming from the Dongjing Formation, and combined with other mamenchisaurs from throughout Eastern Asia, it really helps to suggest that this was a hotspot for their evolution. Meanwhile, there were many things happening in the oceans during the Jurassic, including the evolution of things more like modern-day squid and cuttlefish than previously, and this includes things that were bearing a gladius. A gladius is the cuttlebone in cuttlefish, and it still exists in things like squid, but it's just not quite as hard. New fossils from the Schistes Cartons formation of France help to suggest this may have been where they evolved, because there's multiple different types of gladii that have been found in the formation, and really suggests that, yeah, these cephalopods that are now totally global, including giant things like giant squid, they all started potentially in France, as France would have been part of the European archipelago in the Jurassic. But those squid also would have been swimming around with seagoing crocodiles, and by seagoing I mean they spent their entire lives in the ocean. One paper looked at the diet of some of these by looking at stomach contents. What they found isn't necessarily what you'd expect from Metriorhynchus, which generally has a fairly long snout for catching small fish, and that's because they found part of a gill raker in it from Leeds ichthyes. The gill raker essentially would have been used to just filter feed, and there's many fish with that same kind of trait today. However, importantly, Leeds ichthyes was massive, and Metriorhynchus was not. It may have been about as big as me, or even a little bit larger, but Leeds ichthyes would have been maybe 40 feet long, or well over 10 meters. So, massive animal getting eaten by something much smaller really suggests that the Leeds ichthyes had already died and it was just being scavenged on. This also tracks with some fossils of Jurassic sharks, which also seem to have been scavenging on large Leeds ichthyes. But things like Metriorhynchus weren't the first reptiles to really take to the oceans. Most of that actually happened in the Triassic. And new fossils of Dinocephalosaurus really help to show this, because they're able to show that it would have been pretty similar to Tanystropheus, which famously has a massively long neck. It's a very goofy animal. However, with Dinocephalus and a few other animals from the region, it helps to show that the Tanystrophiids probably got their start in southern China, which there would have been the Tethys Sea there, which would have been a shallow sea and very productive, and is likely the reason many of these reptiles started taking to the water. And still with Triassic reptiles, but this time on land, we're looking at Prestasuchus loricatus. I say Prestasuchus here almost with air quotes because this paper renames it, because Prestasuchus loricatus was found not to be Prestasuchus. In fact, there's already a named species of Prestasuchus, Prestasuchus cinquinatus. However, this is not the same animal or even closely related. Instead, the newly named Schultzuchus would have been a poposaurid, so still a pseudosuchian predator on land, but not a rawasuchian the way Prestasuchus was. This helps to show that there's a lot of different groups of essentially land-based crocodiles or crocodile relatives that would have been present in the Triassic and even up until the late Triassic. And they were doing a lot of different things to be able to more or less coexist together. It's also really interesting because it's the earliest known one from South America, going back to even the late part of the Middle Triassic, which is very, very important because most Middle Triassic poposaurs don't come from South America, and sure, everything's connected in Pangea, but there's things like Arizonasaurus, which, believe it or not, comes from Arizona, which famously not in South America. So what this means is potentially there is a large diversity of even poposaurids in South America at the time, and they may have migrated northwards, or maybe evolved somewhere in the middle, but regardless, they got around quick and were able to spread across most of the continents very rapidly. As for why these archosauromorphs became so successful in the Triassic, one paper looked at their locomotion, specifically of the pseudosuchians and the dinosaurs. And what they found is a number of different traits. First off, in the Triassic and early parts of the Triassic, they would have had pretty similar limb lengths. However, later on in the Triassic and then into the Jurassic, you get some huge amounts of disparity, which is essentially diversity, but just about a single trait or multiple traits even, and how they fill different niches. But the disparity comes only in the dinosaurs, where suddenly they're just doing all kinds of different things with their legs to locomote in different ways. This kind of disparity is potentially the reason that dinosaurs became much more successful. For example, theropod dinosaurs became very, very diverse, and most of the pseudosuchians died out other than the lineages that would lead to modern-day crocodilians. What this means is that essentially the ability to move may be the reason that crocodilians became what they are today, and why dinosaurs became the massive giants that they were and dominating the land, just because they had more diversity in how they could get around. Staying in dinosaurs, Bigaroton is a very small tyrannosaurid coming from Mongolia, and it's been kind of up in the air as to what it was, and we can say pretty confidently tyrannosaurid now because of this paper, which really establishes that, yeah, it's a tyrannosaur, it's a very, very young tyrannosaur, potentially even one of the youngest ones that we have a fossil of, and probably Tarbosaurus. It's hard to know for sure because it is a pretty partial fossil. However, Tarbosaurus would have been the dominant predator in those environments, and so it makes sense that, yeah, it would have had baby Tarbosaurus running around. That said, Central Asia did have a lot of different tyrannosaur groups running around at that time during the late Cretaceous, so maybe it's one of these other groups. But for now, at least, it seems like it's most likely a very young Tarbosaurus. There's also a look at Oxoko, a two-fingered oviraptoran coming from Mongolia again. Mongolia is great for fossils, don't know what to tell you. Useful though, Oxoko actually has multiple specimens of different ages. And what this paper did is looked at some of their bone growth and was able to say, hey, look, even these baby ones have crests, which really goes to suggest that it wasn't meant for a kind of sexual display. That said, the crests were still probably used in some sort of social role, especially since they would have been connected to the nasal passages and even young ones had them, meaning potentially it was used to amplify sounds that the animal would have made. So really interesting, but now we're at least getting a little bit better idea of what the crests of different oviraptorans may have been used for. And on the subject of oviraptorans, we can look at the Kignathids, which was a pretty diverse group of oviraptorans that was been found in both Asia and parts of North America, including a single tibia found from the Kirtland Formation of New Mexico. Now, it's just a tibia, we can't say, oh, hey, look, it's a whole new species. However, importantly, it does have a number of traits that have been used to describe new species of Kignathids before, and it doesn't actually line up with any of them. And it helps to really show that potentially these tibia traits that have been used to name species are just universal throughout the Kignathids, meaning we probably shouldn't use some of those species and we need to revise the reason we call them species. Menkaria bata is a new hadrosaur coming from the latest Cretaceous of Morocco. It would have been a lambeosaurine, meaning something like Parasaurolophus or Lambeosaurus, meaning it probably would have had a fairly notable head crest, although this fossil isn't preserved with that head crest. Importantly though, it does show some level of connection between parts of Europe and North Africa. And that's really interesting because these would have been mostly separate continents, however, they clearly came into contact at least some of the time. Additionally, it shows this really huge disparity between what's happening in North America and what was happening in Europe and North Africa. This is because in North America, the Lambeosaurs did really well for a time and then basically died out and were replaced by things like Edmontosaurus. Meanwhile, seemingly in parts of Europe, where there's an animal that's related to it, and parts of North Africa, they were doing just fine. The Lambeosaurus didn't suddenly die out 10 million years to 15 million years before the mass extinction that killed off all of the non-avian dinosaurs. They were still kicking about pretty well. Hadrosaurs are one of the groups of dinosaurs that we know a lot about their eggs, but there's also other groups that have eggs preserved that we don't find as often, including frogs. At least up until now, with the new specimen of the frog, Gansubatrachus quilinensis, which was found to have eggs. Now, the eggs don't seem like they were where they actually would have been in the body. As the animal got compressed, it seems like they shifted slightly, still inside the body cavity, but not as low as you would expect. That said, it does seem like they would have been still in those oviducts, which we do see in modern frogs. And that's because of the way the eggs seem to be stacked in kind of columns on top of one another. It really helps to show that this kind of trait would have been present in frogs as far back as the early Cretaceous, and additionally, it's really interesting because this isn't something you normally find. That said, most frogs, especially those that are swimming, like this one would have been, go through anaplexis, which means when they're mating, the male hangs onto the female's back for a good long time. And what that means is potentially this female frog just got tired, because that happens sometimes. Hauling around an entire separate body takes effort, and sometimes they just don't make it. Additionally, frogs don't normally breed when there's very, very tense and strict environmental conditions, which means it was probably at least moderately okay as far as the environment. What this means is potentially this frog had a hanger-on that hung on too tightly, and eventually they sunk into oxygen-depleted lower waters of this lake, and the male may have been able to escape because they weren't using all of their energy trying to carry around a whole separate body, but the female didn't, and fortunately for us, it was fossilized and we found it, but really unfortunate for the frog. As for other animals in the water, we are taking an entirely different shift towards whales. And the first thing we're going to look at is actually Kentriodon. Kentriodon would have been moderately closely related to modern-day dolphins. And this is interesting because this is a new fossil that's earlier than the others and comes from Italy, which potentially suggests that they started in parts of Europe in the shallow early Mediterranean Sea, and then were fairly quickly able to migrate into parts of North America, and then through the Panama Canal, except the Panama Canal didn't exist yet, and the continents weren't together. Essentially, there's just a gap between the continents that they were able to move through. And then from there, we're able to spread across more of the world. There was also a look at Prusitis, the so-called potential rival to blue whale for being the heaviest animal on record. And that's because its bones were not like most whales, they were very, very dense. This paper essentially just went, okay, but how much does bone density actually impact the mass of an animal? And also potentially how long could it have been? What they found is a much more reasonable estimate of potentially around the weight of a sperm whale, which is still a very large animal, but not quite the size of a blue whale. This also makes sense when you're looking at the kind of ocean productivity that would have existed around Peru where it was found at the time it would have lived in the Eocene. While this might seem disappointing to some, that weight of being around the weight of a sperm whale still puts it at 10 times heavier than other large whales from the Eocene, such as Basilosaurus. So it's still a massive animal and probably going to be very important for our understanding of whale diversity in the fossil record. The authors have also hinted at more material potentially coming from Peru, so hopefully there will be something that pops out there and we can go, hey look, we know more about Prusitis. Maybe we even have a skull, because the skull's unknown and we're just kind of slapping a Basilosaurus skull on it. May have been very different. There's also Aria rirahua, which is a dolphin coming from the Oligocene of New Zealand. Like many of the dolphins from New Zealand, it seems to have kind of procumbent teeth that would have been very pointy and potentially even stuck out of the skull a little bit. Importantly though, it would have had a much more flexible neck than most other dolphins, and also is fairly small at around 2 meters or 6 feet. What this means potentially is that this organism was very good at swimming in shallow water and catching fish. And rather than potentially swinging its head side to side the way has been proposed for some of the other New Zealand dolphins, it potentially just essentially caged fish in and was able to pseudo-filter feed small fish. Speaking of a flexible neck, there was also a study on how flexible and how different joints might have moved in dinosaurs, specifically Deinonychus. And this was done by looking at different textures on bones and comparing those in things like emus and guinea fowl to what we find in fossils of Deinonychus. And they actually even have a full 3D model that they animated to move the way that they expect it would have. And it looks pretty good. My main issue with this paper is Deinonychus has been pretty well studied and other dromaeosaurs also have been pretty well studied. I want to see this done on something like Nothronicus or Therizinosaurus, where we can tell it's just totally different than anything else, because that would help us understand their movement quite a bit better. As for other parts of movement, there's the shoulders, which this new study looked at the shoulder evolution of Penoraptora, which is essentially birds and things closely related to birds. What they found is it wasn't a gradual change into the shoulder muscles that we do see in modern day birds. Instead, it seems like it evolved independently multiple times, and once it evolved, it pretty much stuck around. And it was very rapid to adopt that kind of shoulder posture in order to facilitate better flight. What this means is that birds probably didn't evolve their shoulder structure totally independently. Instead, they probably inherited it from their non-bird ancestors, and then it modified slightly, but not significantly, as more pressures continued to rise for increasing the ability to fly better. On the note of the ancestors being able to fly, there was also a paper that looked at how different lengths of different feathers on the wing might influence flight. And there's also some numbers that are involved there too, with certain numbers of feathers, especially primary feathers, that's the ones on the lower part of the arm, might influence the ability of an organism to fly. So this graph shows this really well. You can kind of see where the cutoff is, where if the front part of the feather is about equal to the rear part of the feather, you're not going to be taking off. Instead, you want a much longer back part of the feather on the primary feathers. Based on this study and the counts of different feathers, they actually suggest that things like Caudipteryx and Oviraptoran and Ancyornis were actually secondarily flightless, and that their ancestor would have been capable of flight. This is really important because Caudipteryx is just outside of Paraaves, which is the group that includes modern birds and also things like dromaeosaurs, the raptor dinosaurs. but Ancient is also just inside of that group, which suggests that the ancestor to all of these organisms could fly, and then some of them just secondarily ended up not being able to. On some of those birds, we have the Eantornithines, which are the opposite birds. They're the sister group to modern birds, and many of them had teeth. However, at least one of them didn't. Imperavis attenboroughii is the species that's now been described as not having teeth. And it also seems like another species, Chiapiavis, also wouldn't have had teeth. The thing is, based on these fossils, their bills would have actually closed in different ways, meaning they probably were taking up different niches. The paper doesn't really look at Chiapiavis that much, however it does suggest that Imperavis would have probably been kind of like a chicken, for lack of a better term, mostly browsing on whatever it could find on the forest floor. This also is important though because these two Eantornithines aren't closely related, meaning that this kind of toothlessness evolved separately in each of them. Essentially, both of them had evolutionary reason to lose their teeth. And now we're jumping into papers that I did entire separate videos on. The first of which is still on a bird, but a terror bird. And it's not very complete, it's just some toe claws. However, they do show that it would have been a terror bird, and importantly, coming from Antarctica, which seems wild now, but during the Eocene, it would have been a much warmer environment, at least around Antarctica, and it would have supported some pretty broad diversity of life. It also suggests potentially that for the terror birds, they may have started very far south in Antarctica, and the Drake Passage probably wasn't open. This means that if the terror birds, or at least their ancestors, did survive the KPG impact by being in Antarctica, they could then migrate up into South America where they became much more diverse. And then there's Rioja venatrix, which is a new Spinosaurine coming from Iberia. There's a huge amount of diversity in Iberian Spinosaurs and Spinosaurines. What this suggests is potentially Iberia, which would have kind of been on its own during large parts of the Mesozoic, may have been the key point of evolution for most of the Spinosaurs. It's also interesting because it seems like it was an early diverging one with some megalosaur-like traits, but it also is one of the last ones found in Spain. Meanwhile, we do still have some things like Spinosaurus, which would have lived a bit later. Again, seems like this kind of Iberian and maybe even North African, depending on if we find fossils from the right time there, kind of region may have been very important for their evolution. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Really appreciate it, especially since this one's obviously getting out so late. Lots of life stuff happening. Hopefully you're going to be doing like real science here in a bit, as opposed to just like the science education stuff. So, been busy with that, and then my wife's work, since she edits, that also slowed us down, so we've just been all over the place. With all that said, if you stayed and, stuck around, obviously, again, it's late, but appreciate it. This one obviously took a lot more work because it's also just longer than a lot of them. With all that said, be safe, take care, don't go extinct.